going to be an interesting stream. I think it's going to be an interesting stream. But again, it's mostly because I'm indulging my own curiosity and not really caring about anybody else, as happens on occasion. We are in 310, and we're taking a break from the literal reading itself, because where we're at in Anti-Oedipus is making our way through sort of the steps as they describe it for the need for something beyond coding. Coding being how meaning is developed and cultivated inside of the socii of the earth and the despotic. But in capital, representation has a different base. There isn't quite the same coding of meaning as we see elsewhere. But it's not overcoding, as we saw inside of the despotic, which basically overwrites codes, which allows, sort of the little codes to happen wherever they happen. But the sort of overrunning of that, of king's edicts and other meanings, that allows that sort of base thing underneath to sort of make its due. This, in this way, is completely different in capital. Now, the challenge is, the term they use for it is the axiomatic. And I say the trouble that they use this term is because fucking this isn't easy. This is where they get almost needlessly complicated, to be perfectly frank. It's not needlessly at all. They talk about how under capitalism we have axiomatizing desire. Now, what does that mean? Now, generally how people take this, how I took it my first time, but also I very much have learned at this point how people take this, is the idea of an axiom one lives their life by. Sort of not using it in the mathematical theory directly, but instead saying, oh, we have axioms. Penny saved is a penny earned, which are really syllogisms, which are really sort of figures of speech. This is not the case here. What an axiom is and how it sort of interplays with everything else, it's a little bit more complicated than that. Put it just, very, very lightly. So what I want to do is I want to go over the term axiom today. We're going to spend time really making sure we hit it specifically. And for me, one of my favorite papers on this, and it's a paper, so this is a bit of a bear. It's only, I want to say 20 pages, but we're going to do most of it today. It's a breezy read until it's the opposite of a breezy read. So at those junctures, we'll take a break. We'll stop for a moment. We will have a conversation, and I want everyone to please take place. Anyone who's around, whether you're out on the YouTube stream or you're here in Discord, voice, text, whatever it may be, this is a complex thing. I do not claim even slightly to have a strong grasp of it. I won't pretend that that's the case. What I will say is, I know a couple things it's not, thanks to all of my wonderful time being in here in this DGQC and in the Deleuze Discord, and then in the Deleuze subreddit. I know a whole bunch of things it fucking totally is. So, with that being said, totally here to make our way slowly through this. You should be able to see my screen and my text. There'd be an introduction at the top, and we are going to make our way through. It's going to be more of maybe a research stream than anything else. I have a couple of things going where we're going to discuss, we're going to chat, we're going to look things up. I'm trying to find, if anyone has or can find Daniel Smith's paper on axiomatics. It's a Word doc, and for some reason I can't find it on my entire machine. It's very frustrating to me, because I know I had it. Daniel Smith's wonderful essay on axiomatics I seem to have fucking lost. It's just about as angering as I think it can be. But hey, that's the setup today. Without further ado, we're going to just get underway. In A Thousand Plateaus, Deleuze and Guattari claim that capitalism is organized according to an axiomatic, a term more closely associated with set theory rather than political theory. In this paper, I want to explore this claim, which, for Deleuze and Guattari, is given a particularly strong formulation. For them, capitalism and present-day politics are an axiomatic in the literal sense. The question I want to address in particular is whether such a strong position can be really justified, given the apparent differences between the political and mathematical realms. Many of these difficulties rest on the apparent differences between Deleuze and Guattari's emphasis on the intensive nature of forms of organization of many kinds, including political organization, and the fact that set theory seems to deal exclusively with sets, which are understood as operating purely in terms of discrete, extensive entities. If capitalism cannot include the key Deleuzian term of intensity, then this presents us with a choice between rejecting the idea that capitalism is axiomatic or rejecting the possibility of an intensive multiplicity. In this paper, I want to argue that this choice is a false choice and emerges from not giving sufficient weight to the Kantian aspects of Deleuze and Guattari's politics. Returning to Deleuze's lectures on A Thousand Plateaus reveals that they do not read the notion of axiomatics purely in terms of set theory, but argue that the central structures of Kant's transcendental idealism form an axiomatic. I'm going to pause randomly throughout this. This is probably where my understanding of this comes strongest. This thing is why I like this paper. This is the thing that struck me first. There's a lot of things coming on. When we talk about the axiomatic, it's impossible to do this in Anti-Oedipus, or he uses A Thousand Plateaus. We're in the middle of Anti-Oedipus. It's the same, by the way. They're just two books about the same shit. It's necessary to sort of pull back and have a conversation about what is set theory, how does this come in. Set theory in general, mathematics at this sort of extensive level within Deleuze is incredibly important. And I'm saying that very, very lightly when I say it's incredibly important. A lot of the stuff they talk about, from the derivative to flux, to how the flux is cut up, how it breaks apart, where we find our lines of flight. There's a lot of mathematical language that they utilize, and there's a reason for that. Leaps and bounds were being made in mathematics at the time. They were really part of a generation they sort of came of age and were able to write, and other writers of their time were coming of age in the 50s and 60s, when mathematics was changing drastically, and it became center to everything very much Deleuze wrote about. If you go through and you read pretty much anything he wrote, there is a strong mathematical core to it. There's a reason for that, but here specifically, the way that they're trying to integrate this into what they did with capitalism, schizophrenia, which is Anti-Oedipus and A Thousand Plateaus, I'm going to start just saying that combination, is they're trying to bring sort of this unifying philosophy of everything into how things work. They want to bring it all in. They want to combine a whole bunch of stuffs. Now, Deleuze is doing this through how set theory operates particularly, because the way that their axiomatic works is not just set theory, but also structural. And this is the thing that's kind of an odd move. If you don't have background in set theory, ignore everything I'm saying, because you'll be like, what the fuck? But if you have any idea of what set theory is, just keep it a little fuzzier than normal as we make our way through this. To continue, this Kantian moment shows itself most prominently in the notion of binding, which becomes central here to Deleuze and Guattari's politics. In section 1, I will set out the two different roots of the term axiomatic in D&G's thought. The first of these is the axiomatic approach to formalizing fields of mathematics. The second, the Kantian account of the indeterminate relationship between the transcendental unity of apperception and the transcendental object. Yeah, that's going to be a thing. We'll get to it, don't worry. In section 2, we will see how this transcendental aspect of Deleuze and Guattari's account of axiomatics is expressed in the notion of binding, which Deleuze and Guattari take to be a process that forces us to understand a field of entities in a certain manner. Namely, as clearly delimited and deployed in a homogeneous space. I will argue that this process of binding operates as a transcendental condition for capitalism for Deleuze and Guattari. Section 3 addresses some of the details of the axiomatic itself, drawing out why a Kantian reading of D&G's account, blah, blah, blah. Section 4 analyzes D&G's account of the outside of capitalism, using the double signification of the nominal to understand the complex relationship between what they call the war machine and its representation within the axiomatic. We will get to this part if I have to force it and we end up going far long. The example of the war machine is what they primarily are using in 1,000 Plateaus, but it is one that will help us understand how they mean the term axiomatic, because it's a good structure for us to observe. It's a good axiomatic, really, for us to understand. Bringing this Kantian moment allows us to see more clearly how nuanced D&G's account of capitalism is. And it is extremely nuanced. Is everyone following so far? Because I know it's a bitch. This is a thing. I know. A little bit different than normal, but there's little emojis if you're in the Discord that you can hit just to make sure. Okay, we're going strong. Going strong. The original PDF. Oh, sorry. It's one of those days. The original PDF I'm going to be tossing right here, if I can. There. Checking to see if... Oh, God. Who posted that? Bats, you're my hero. We have someone found my Daniel Smith essay that I've been looking. Great. Excellent. All right. Now let's talk. What is an axiomatic? Deleuze and Guattari claim that... I'm going to be, by the way, pausing a lot more than just at every paragraph, because as we go, I don't want to stop and revisit. We're not here to understand this paper. We're here to understand the concept. At least I am. So if I break up too much, just tell me to fuck myself and make a comment somewhere. Feel free. Deleuze and Guattari claim that the definitive feature of social formations is not the mode of production, which we might see as central in Marxist thought, but rather the structures of organization that characterize these formations. Focusing on organization allows D&G to relate a range of seemingly diverse fields and to argue there is a direct connection between a model of the structure of thinking and the structure of society. This is where we need to start. As I say, for Marx, the mode of production itself, a very particular structure, is the entire point. But they're noticing, and I tend to agree with this reading even of Marx, is that rather than the structures themselves, it's actually the organization of the structures that characterize those formations. It is a slightly meta view of what Marx is talking about. Because we're then focusing on the organization rather than the content of things. We've been going through this the last, I want to say, few months as we've slowly made our way into capitalism. Instead of talking about the content of the thing, which is Marxist focus, the modes of production, instead we can start to notice that there is sort of a mapping, a diagram. There is an arrangement. The arrangement itself seems to be this odd thing that we're able to start critiquing and understanding. Because of that arrangement, sans content, we can start pulling in that arrangement as it exists in other fields. So when we see a very particular arrangement, the war machine is going to be it. When we see a particular arrangement of things, as they say, the organization of things, organ being the core word of why they use that in Anti-Oedipus, organizing. You'll see it with a dash. That's not a mistranslation. It's intentional. They're able to take the organs instead of the content of them. And those organs you can start to see in other fields besides just, the modes of production. It can be the modes of production of science, the modes of production of mathematics, modes of production of literature. It can be all of these things that we start to see, oh, look, this stuff is kind of everywhere, but it's different stuff. How does that work? How does that happen? This setup, in turn, allows the claim that capitalism is literally an axiomatic, a term normally applied to a rigorous methodological exploration of the foundations of field of mathematics. It's a little bit funny. Deleuze writes of the axiomatic that, quote, whenever you have a system of relation between unspecified elements, you're in the domain of an axiomatic, defining it as, quote, precisely the system of elements considered as unqualified elements. This is a beast of a thing. We'll get to it. Not the full point. They're pulling quotes from a lot of places. I'm not chasing it down. We can see two related roots of the state here. First, they associate the state. First, they associate it with the axiomatization that takes place in mathematics. The aspect of axiomatization has been the most prominent in the literature on the axiomatic of capitalism to date. There's a second moment, however, where D&G associate axiomatics with transcendental idealist philosophy and its successors in the German idealist tradition. Without recognizing this moment, we risk downplaying one of the central characteristics of the axiomatic, namely, that it operates as a transcendental structure, bringing with it the notion of a transcendental illusion at the heart of capitalism. The lectures that they're talking about post Thousand Plateaus, they end up quoting here, and I'm just going to sort of read on the footnote. It is in this lecture that Deleuze recognizes the relation between the transcendental unity of apperception and the transcendental object meets what he takes to be Bourbaki's claim that, quote, there is an axiomatic every time you find yourself faced with, or every time you build relations, every time you determine relations between unspecified elements. His claim that capitalism is the relation between a subject posed as universal and an object posed as any object whatsoever will be unpacked in this essay, but already highlights the relevance of Kant. Kant's here. If you don't have a background in Kant, I'm not getting into Kant. You can hate me forever. That's fine. But we're going to be staying where this paper takes us. What they're talking about here is, as I mentioned, this sort of odd thing that we're able to do when we start looking at the superstructure. We start looking at the elements that sort of are conditioning how the process is made. When we talk about the organs, the organization of things is that second step. There's this odd thing capitalism does that is not done in other ways. Other ways, the earth and the despot, through coding. And in Anti-Oedipus, we went through and we just spent a lot of time actually going deep in to why Anti-Oedipus sort of outlines the need for us to move on and have something beyond coding, to just sort of revisit one or two of those. Money as an equivalent represents an abstract quantity indifferent to the qualified nature of flux. The way money sort of allows things to be brought down to a deeply quantitative element, and it forces it to be continuous. The example they give is Marx's MCM, money, commodity, money, where we start with, if we start with commodity, we sell the commodity, we use that to buy another commodity that we use. We make a table, sell it for 5 pieces of gold, and then we use that 5 pieces of gold to buy an ox. It begins and ends with those transactions. That's the end of those transactions. We could say effectively that the process is consumed. But with Marx, because money is a general equivalent to everything and kind of starts it off, I pay you $10 for the work you've done. You then buy something with that $10 and you must actually get more. You then in turn get more money. The money is never consumed. It's sort of processed. The circulation has no limits, as Marx says. They use a handful of examples of this, but this is this sort of odd thing. There's this structure that is in place that money starts, then commodity, then money. Well, what's doing this? Why is this happening? What is conditioning the entirety of the structure? This here is effectively what we're talking about. This is the axiomatic. And this is the play they're taking about. So we're going to start with, and I'm sorry if everyone's eyes glaze over, we're going to start with the mathematical version of the axiomatic. Let us begin with the mathematical account of axiomatics. Here, axiomatics is the attempt to provide a rigorous foundation for areas of mathematics such as geometry. Axiomatics emerged from the attempt to avoid the kind of ambiguities that are taken to emerge from implicitly giving intuitive meanings to terms in a proof. Why does 2 + 2 = 4? Why is a circle what it is? These things have a general ambiguity if we kind of have a proof that's more on the intuitive side of things. We need to get to the point of the axiomatization of things. We need to get to the hard sort of concrete base of the structure of the thing. There's axiomatics within mathematics. I'm not a calc guy. Someone's going to yell at me in the comments. Someone's going to tell me I'm a shithead. But that's baseline for us for us different kinds of nerds. I shouldn't say non-nerds. What the fuck am I doing here? I'm reading about an axiomatic PDF. God damn it. Let us begin. So we're here. These intuitive meanings give the proof a persuasive value, but can also cover over strictly logical relations between terms or lead to intuitive but false claims being taken as true. The axiomatic approach attempts to solve these problems by explicitly enumerating primitive terms and axioms, defining relations, defining relations between terms purely logically, and bracketing the question of the meaning of primitive terms and relations. To give an example, Blanche, Deleuze and Guattari's key source here, introduces Peano's theory of arithmetic. It assumes 3 primitive terms: 0, number, and successor of. This is really good at digestible shit, by the way. I really like this. So 0 is what it is. You know what 0 is. You know number, and you know successor of. The following primitive propositions define the series of natural numbers. 0 is a number. Successor of a number is a number. Different numbers do not have the same successor. 0 is not the successor of any number. If a property belongs to 0, and if, when it belongs to a given number, it belongs to the successor of that number, then it belongs to all numbers, such as the principle of induction. Now, this is baseline, basic shit. Another great example of this, if you want to go read it, Gödel, Escher, and Bach. Hofstadter goes way deep into the axiomatization of this type of setup. These things are baseline for how we understand. I've got a 6-year-old I'm teaching math right now. These are baseline. I don't sort of we don't think about these things. These are things you don't conceptualize when doing math. I'm not going to teach him these things. But these are the presumptions that allow mathematics as a logical system to work as we know it. 0 is a number. The successor of a number must also be a number. Different numbers do not have the same successor, and 0 is not the successor of any number. This setup gives us natural numbers. Really fascinating, really basic, really simple. Really dig it. We'll continue just this part. We can see how the first 2 propositions, 0 is a number, the successor of a number is a number. These 2 propositions of Arachne, why is 0 not the successor of any number? Well, it doesn't come after any number. If we want to talk about negative numbers, we're not talking about naturals anymore. The natural numbers, zeros can't come after it, so it can't be the successor. I don't think negative numbers are natural numbers. Am I wrong on that? That's a thing I should know. I feel like I should know that. Yes, they're not. Good. Hey, look at that. Look at that. 25 years after my last math class. And as Bat says, sometimes 1 is taken as the origin element instead of 0. But the idea, if we start with these, we're starting inside of this one. So 0 as a number, natural numbers, which we would use to count stuff. Again, don't think hyper-complex math. This is some good basic grunt math, like I'm teaching my 6-year-old. So we have a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 0 is a number. Successor of a number is a number. Different numbers do not have the same successor. 2 has a successor of 3. 3 is not the successor of any other number. Again, natural numbers, naturals. And 0 isn't a successor. This is basic, good. This is like the most baseline shit. Don't overcomplicate it. I know you want to. Trust me, my brain does that too. But this is just numbers as Sesame Street knows them, I think would be the way to put it. Now we take these first two. 2 seconds. All right. We can take the first two propositions together to define the number 1, and then in turn to define the number 2, etc. As such, by recursively applying these propositions, we can generate the whole series of natural numbers. Launch notes that because we are dealing with the axiomatic theory here, the primitive terms are indeterminate and hence do not unambiguously determine one set of concrete propositions. This means that there are several particular meanings we can give them. This is really important. So pay attention to this, because this is those things, those lines, that 0 is a number, successor of a number, these things that they do not unambiguously determine one set of concrete propositions because they are indeterminate themselves. Stick with that. As Russell points out, if, for example, we give successor its usual meaning, but understand by 0 any given number, say 100, and by number each of the numbers starting from 100, the 5 axioms remain true together with, of course, all the theorems deducible from them. In the same way we could, by giving 0 its ordinary meaning, understand by number pairs of numbers only, and by successor the next but one after. Or again, with 0 standing for the number 1, with successor meaning half. Number would denote each of the terms in the series 1, 1/2, 1/4, etc. This is a really fascinating way that these things work, the axiomatic operates. We immediately, and it's because I told you very specifically that we were talking about natural numbers like kindergartners and all that, but we can just switch number for other things. That and suddenly these rules work for everything that comes on after them. The setup for this, the way that it operates, the way that these things work, this is kind of the big deal for the axiomatic. That makes sense. I'm hoping it does generally. 2 seconds. All right. My stream free? No, it's going. Okay. I'm just very still, it seems. So when we start with the axiomatic, the terms themselves are odd as they're sort of set up. They're ambiguous. They do not ambiguously determine one set of concrete propositions. Instead, from them, the way they interrelate comes together. As they say, if we go back through and we give successor its usual meaning, which means after, but we understand 0, any number. 0 doesn't have to mean literally 0, the complex setup, but instead we go, 0, the word 0 means 100. There you go. So 100 is a number. The successor of any number is a number. And successor, we can make 3s. So 103, 106. That's what successor means. But 102 wouldn't fit that. Fine. This works because ultimately each of these series building from this is internally cohesive. Okay? So in this sense, we have a series of indeterminate primitives, which can be expressed in a variety of models. D&G will argue that this abstraction of the axiomatic is central to capitalism, where I claim it leads eventually to what they call machinic enslavement. Just as the axiomatic method deliberately avoids the question of sense to give a rigorous account of the relations between terms, capitalism reduces the self to an unspecified relation within a system of knowledge. Yeah, see? Hey, we're getting there. Okay, this is the point. The way that the axiomatic works is we have in mathematics, 0 is a number, successor number, blah, blah, but there's no rule of what 0 means. You can add that as another axiomatic. Okay? There's another axiomatic in there, but that just becomes another axiomatic, which we don't really want. We want the process which allows the sort of the way that a crystal forms around the thing just to go and run. So we want them sort of ambiguous, to be frank. And then we have a whole bunch of series that stem off from that. This series can be expressed in a variety of models. The abstraction of the axiomatic is central to capitalism. Just as the axiomatic method deliberately avoids the question of sense to give a rigorous account of relations between terms, the question of sense being what is like 0, why does this relate to this other part of the axiomatic? If this is how natural numbers work, according to Blanche, how do these elements resonate with each other? How do we find the resonance, and how do they make sense together? How do they produce sense? They don't care. It doesn't give a shit. It actually doesn't want to do any of that. It's just doing the thing. And just like that, capitalism reduces the self to an unspecified relation within a system of knowledge, the self being our subjectivity that comes at the end of the process, that self, right? Self, right? All right, get the quote. This aggregate includes both subjection and enslavement taken to extremes, as two simultaneous parts that constantly reinforce and nourish each other. For example, one is subjected to TV insofar as one uses and consumes it in the very particular situation of a subject of the statement that more or less mistakes itself for a subject of enunciation. The example they give is one where TV used to say, you kids won't know it, you television viewers, you are what makes NBC what it is. Viewers like you on PBS. Social media is like that version par excellence. Facebook is only what the users put to it. That's it. You make Facebook what it is. The technical machine is the medium between two subjects. But one is enslaved by TV as a human machine insofar as the television viewers are no longer consumers or users, nor even subjects who supposedly make it, but intrinsic component pieces, the input and output, feedback or recurrences that are no longer connected to the machine in such a way as to produce or use it. Like in social media. Actually, fucking spot on. Again, par excellence version of this. But, and this is where there's going to be a lot of stuff that comes with this, but if you are old enough to remember any of these social media sites when they first started, and I mean first started like first year at the longest, and even shorter than that ideally, 2006 through 2008, 2005 with Dig and earlier, internet sites, blogs, anything that's made TV when it first got going, whatever it was, the input and output change actually wasn't what they were when it first started. Actually, users were first connected originally to these things as producing it. Like, no one knew what these machines were or how they worked. We would produce things within it. They would make what would become hard and fast rules of what these things needed to be. But as that grew and as it became a thing, it's no longer that you are the sort of producer or user of it. Now you are an input and output in the much larger machine. This is important as a distinction. D&G point to a second moment of the axiomatic, which emerges. Drew, I did say this about the DGQC. It's one of the reasons that we have a lot of, I try to go in and shake things up significantly. It's a challenge. The DGQC is a challenge because when we first started, we had no idea what we were doing. Like literally, it was just a single, like we had one text channel and the voice channel. And we were all users of it. Like literally, everyone would come in, they'd post stuff, they'd put stuff in, and then they'd use it and they'd come out. But as we've grown, we have 4,000 people, and we don't have 4,000 users. We just don't. like the number of people who actively post or do anything is incredibly small in comparison to the number of people who are in the server overall. The number of people who are listening to me right now, incredibly small, even though I love all of you. This setup switches everyone's relation, including mine, by the way, as I'm literally the creator of this Discord. The relation is no longer someone who uses this, but instead as an input or output for what the DGQC has become. This is true of all social media sites. This is true of multiplayer video games. This is true of marketplaces. This is true of capitalism and democracy. This setup where we are inputs and outputs instead of someone who produces and uses the thing. This distinction is incredibly important as we get moving, especially when we include the second moment. Because we're about to get into Kant. I'm not going to dive into Kant deep because I think it might kill me. I'm pretty sure it would actually kill me. But we'll get lightly through it. If anyone here is a Kanti, I can't help but say that, sorry, is Kanti, you are free to interrupt me at any point and let me know. And that's going to be the only time I use that pun all day today. Deleuze and Guattari point to a second moment of the axiomatic, which emerges from the unqualified element of Kant's transcendental philosophy. In the transcendental deduction of Critique of Pure Reason, Kant aims to show that concepts such as causation can be known to apply to experience. He begins with a simple claim about self-consciousness. It must be possible for the I think to accompany all my representations, or otherwise something would be represented in me which could not be thought at all, and that is equivalent to saying that the representation would be impossible, or at least would be nothing to me. This is a continuation, or I don't know, prior to, I shouldn't say continuation. This is along the lines of the same argument you've seen Deleuze or Nietzsche make. Nietzsche and Freud, so many. Spinoza as well. Like this is one of the things that sort of began to sort of break this thing down of that we aren't just one simple soul in a body, that no, there isn't just a brain doing all these things. There are parts that do different things. For Nietzsche, for example, he talked of the parts of us that react to the world and the parts of us that remember things. These two parts can't be the same thing. You can't be experiencing and taking in and recording while you're actually reacting to the world. These two parts of the world, they can't be the same point. A point can only do one thing. A process can only do one thing. This is the brunt of this same argument, because if I say, I think I'm hungry, I can't be the same thing that the hunger can't also be me. I have to have I think. If I say I'm hungry, I'm directly perceiving my own hunger, but how would I be doing that? Because that would be represented in me, but I would be the one representing it and recognizing it at the same time in that sentence. Just doesn't work, and it doesn't work that way. This claim amounts to noting that without being able to see all of my experiences as my own, experience itself would be fragmentary. I think the thread of Brooks is what unites all of the things I experience. Otherwise, it would be disparate and unknown. I have to have that thread. This analytic unity for Kant presupposes a moment of synthesis, since even if we take our experiences to be naturally unified, we still need a synthesis on the part of the subject by which we recognize the unity. And this is more Kant. Sorry. That relation comes about not simply through my accompanying each representation with consciousness, but only insofar as I conjoin one representation with another and am conscious of the synthesis of them. Only in so far, therefore, as I can unite a manifold of given representations of one consciousness, is it possible for me to represent to myself the identity of the consciousness throughout these representations. In other words, the analytic unity of apperception is possible only under the presupposition of a certain synthetic unity. Kant, Deleuze loves one of his examples Kant uses, which is the cinnabar. The ability of me to presume that experience is going to be consistent, and I'll get to what that means in a second, is necessary for us to even be able to have reason or conversation or subjectivity or anything we take for granted. Or if cinnabar is the example, but no one knows what cinnabar is, so I'm just going to use a different example. If I were to say if I were to notice that the trees have green leaves or brown leaves, depending. Right now they're green, but I get that across. I say, look, they're green. The ability for me to be able to trust that that will be true again in 5 minutes or 20 seconds or 5 years, that there is some uniform reality to that. This becomes the only way I'm able to deal with reality. Cinnabar, if I couldn't know that these things will always generally have the same mass, the same weight, the same color, cinnabar being red, a desk will always be generally a desk's weight. And if it's not, something's weird with the desk. There's this unity that's required as a baseline presupposition of experience as we discuss it. To continue the paper, what provides this unity is that we relate all of our representations together as being representations of an object, corresponding to the synthetic transcendental unity of apperception. Then is the notion of a transcendental object. Now, this synthetic, I think, which makes the unity of experience possible, precedes experience, so cannot be understood in terms of the categories we use to understand it. This is the challenge with, this is Kant's entire project, but I would say Deleuze's and Spinoza's and others, is as we get closer to imminent actual experience, we're talking about something that precedes it. We're talking about something that precedes our ability to actually cognize and discuss it, which means anything we would use to describe the world doesn't work anymore, like as a thing. So we have to be very careful about how we talk about categories and how we deal with it. Similarly, the object that is the correlate of the I is simply an indeterminate object that provides a placeholder for synthesis. Again, to go back to the way we were talking about sets earlier, the way that we're talking about these things. We have all of these axiomatic understandings of things that are sort of out there. We have this presumed transcendental objects that we're able to see, my keyboard, my cup, that generally I'm able to sort of allow to transfer. So that way I don't have to reassess how heavy my teacup is every time I pick it up. My body is able to trust that it's going to be slightly lighter after I take a sip. And then when I sit it down, I'm not having to rejudge. There's these transcendental objects. But with this, I think is part of this. I think this. It's necessitated. There has to be something that considers it. There has to be a unifying thread and positionality of me thinking, I think this, or that I'm experiencing this coffee cup. But the I, this is indeterminate. This doesn't have a thing. There's no baseline here. There's no I that exists meaningfully. The quote from Deleuze, the cogito in Kant is expressed like this. I think and, insofar as I think of any object whatsoever, namely what Kant names with a very beautiful word. The object equals X. Deleuze considers Kant account here to fulfill the definition of an axiomatic, insofar as Kant's transcendental logic operates in terms of a set of relations, the categories, between two objects that are completely indeterminate, just as zero and successor and number. They're indeterminate themselves. We assign them, we fill that up. The same thing here. I and coffee cup, I and teacup. The coffee cup because I'm just tired. But this setup is the thing that we're sort of talking about. Deleuze and Guattari argue, following Marx, that we find an analogous structure at work in capitalism, or perhaps even, given the subject and object are indeterminate for Kant, same structure. Well, in prior social forms, labor and wealth are defined in terms of a particular aspect. wealth as land in pre-capitalist societies. With capitalism, we arrive at a conception of wealth as something not tied to a particular form of expression. With it, the notion of labor is equally abstract. You can start to see where we're connecting back in. Huh? You're starting to see where we're connecting back in? To quote Marx, it was of tremendous advance on the part of Adam Smith to throw aside all limitations which mark wealth-producing activity and to define it as labor in general, neither industrial nor commercial nor agricultural, or one as much as the other. Along with the universal character of wealth-creating activity, we have now the universal character of the object defined as wealth, vis-a-vis product in general or labor in general, but as past incorporated labor. This, again, to talk about zero, to go back to that same, I'm just going to keep referring back to that same thing again and again. Zero, number, successor. They're indeterminate, but the rules inside of them condition whether or not we sort of follow, like condition what can come of them. But they're themselves indeterminate. I am indeterminate. What the dollar is, value, these things, this wealth, this labor, these other things, also indeterminate. In his lectures, Deleuze reads Marx's claims here. We're going to go over this whole paragraph, don't worry, it's a bear, but it's a good one. Deleuze reads Marx's claims here on a Kantian model, defining capital as, quote, the subjectivity of wealth. It is wealth insofar as universal subjectivity, that is, it is wealth which is no longer qualified or determined as such objectively, land wealth, monetary wealth, this wealth, that wealth, but which is wealth itself related to the wealth-creating activity, namely capital. Capital is the subject of wealth-creating activity. This relates to the universality of the object insofar as being wealth, namely labor, which, for its part, was no longer determined as this or that, but as unspecified labor. Between the two, rather than the categories, we have a series of abstract rights that allow us to convert indeterminate wealth into determinate goods, while overcoding develops an abstract unity over an intensive set of relations. Capitalism is instead a process that immanently determines the field it governs by transposing it into an extensive multiplicity. In Difference and Repetition, Deleuze argues that Kant's transcendental deduction is an extensive representation of processes that operate intensively, a surface effect of these processes. And the same seems true here. Just as Kant's transcendental deduction guarantees that the structures of judgment apply to all phenomena, the axiomatic of capitalism presents all phenomena in terms of abstract rights connected to capital. Deleuze and Guattari called this process of fixing phenomena within a system of coordinates so that these abstract categories can apply to them as binding. As we shall see, binding represents a transcendental condition within which a system of axiomatics can operate, but also a transcendental illusion that reduces all determination to an extensive model. I know it's a lot. First, start typing your questions if you have one, or whatever, because it is a lot. But the big deal here, and it's one of the reasons, again, I've really attached to Deleuze's reading and the work that's been done on since Albertine Smith, stunning work, State and Marx with Deleuze and Guattari. The people who have really taken hold into this direction of understanding capitalism isn't just a concentration of wealth. It's not just rich people here and there. These are things that have happened. This is not what enslaves us. This is not the thing that makes trouble. Because overthrowing a king and installing a new king would no more make people free than overthrowing the capitalists only to have more capitalists. It has to be how these systems are organized, specifically how production operates. And capitalism does it in a very weird, insidious, from underneath, within desire way. And it's kind of the big sort of deal inside of this. Because when we're talking about the axioms of all of this, the indeterminate elements, we now have a couple things to play with. We have obviously the I, me, or you, I guess all of us. We have labor, which has been sort of not determined as, this is blacksmith labor, this is industrial labor. It kind of doesn't matter anymore. Labor's labor. Labor's labor now, very much. There's a fantastic documentary called Ascension that's just like a voiceless video of the world of China. And it's very focused on how the labor market works there, which is fascinating. It's an incredibly fascinating sort of world. The way labor is a fungible thing now, the way capital is a fungible thing. There's a lot of stuff that sort of has moved on and become these sort of odd, indeterminate elements. And so this is the difference. We've had all of these things made indeterminate. And instead, what happens is these indeterminate things, these abstract rights connected to capital, slowly become bound to coordinate systems. We'll explain what that means in a minute, but basically this is where we start talking about how we move from having zero numbers and successor to having the number 150 to determine whether or not it fits within it or how it works or those other. Like this is the brunt of the thrust. Arachne asks, can you explain, while overcoding develops an abstract unity over an intensive set of relations, capitalism is instead a process that imminently determines the field it governs by transposing it into an extensive multiplicity? Yes, this is, the answer is this whole paper and also all of AO. I'll do my best to summarize because this is their critique of capitalism, and it's really complicated, even though it is in this one sentence. When we talk about overcoding, we're talking about the king coming in and giving, this is now my forest. This is the king's forest. There's an intensive set of relations that has happened that creates that forest. That forest is sort of the range of space between this path and another, and it's not really known as land. Hadn't been really divided like that. Now the king comes in, that's the king's forest. This is the overcoding of an abstract unity. The king's forest is an abstract unity over an intensive set of relations, which is this forest and these paths and where these things intersect. This is how the king comes along. We like to say the state does this too, which it does, but then we'll get into that at some point a little bit later in AO. Specifically, capitalism, though, comes along and instead imminently determines the field it governs by transposing it into an extensive multiplicity. Instead of saying on high, this is the king's garden or the king's forest, we say, oh, that land is worth $642 million. That is an extensive multiplicity. Why the fuck is it worth that? There's so many questions you probably have, but go look, you can go see that all land everywhere is set this way. Not set on high. The president of America, as much as Trumpers and like to believe the president sets prices of things or whatever it is, that's not really where we're out. Instead, the value of things has this sort of odd thing where instead of being overwritten from above, what happens is the way we process the thing from the start explodes the thing into the extensive meaning quantitative, numbered, extensive versus intensive elements, and a multiplicity, because it's not, you can't go, well, okay, cool, I'm going to buy this part of it for this small, no, it's worth this amount. And then as you subdivide, it's always consistently being built into this sort of extensive multiplicity. It's always broken down somehow via these weird axiomatizing processes. Josh, hey, welcome, by the way. We're all cogs and machines, Josh. To read, persons as inputs and outputs of larger social machine versus conceptual personas belonging to a machinic assemblage. Social machine, I'm not a cognitive into a larger social machine. Like Nietzsche, I create a new plane. Is a new philosophical plane a cog in a larger machine? Doesn't introduce a new machine that resists it. God damn it, Josh. We need to just have like a stream where we just sit and chat, because this would be a fun convo, but I'm going to answer in terms of this paper and not specifically you. But The ability for you to create a new plane or to create new elements, capitalism has no problem with that because it will create new axiomatics. It will happily take in and create another rule. If we take the original numbers, right? And we go, okay, cool. We have 0 is a number. Number has successors, and 0 can't be a successor of any. So you grab those. Like, cool. I have the number negative 176.2. You come up with this number because you've got a new plane. You're so clever and you're so smart. And capital goes, instead of, again, afterwards, this is the fucked up part of this process as DNG have identified it. It's not that capital or the king comes in and overwrites it. This is how people very much take this because we tend to think of things this way. No, it's that new plane exists. A new axiom will be created because that's how capital works in order for us to have transcendental objects, which would include your plane. And so it'll make room. And it does so very, very quickly. The first thing it does when you have your new plane is you decode, you've broken something down, but then it's axiomatized. And it's not that it's overwritten, that's overcoding, that comes from the king, that's the unity from above. No. This is instead, in order to allow that thing to exist, a new axiom emerges in order to build into it, in order to allow your new plane to be there. We are all parts of cogs in a larger machine. We may build something new. It may break things down further. I would argue, I know people, I would argue that as gender norms, as race norms, as all these norms break down, part of that is because of social media. Part of that is because as we've seen ourselves and all of these things obliterated and atomized and taken into this way, we have on the one side the decoding of the traditional codes of all, and we are seeing them shatter a lot. But at the same time, capital is more than happy to sort of have the rules, the axiomatic pop up that enables those bits of things to exist. And it will continue to do that. It works on both sides. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. They weren't. They weren't. So one of the important distinctions here is definitely to be talking about the temporality of these things. Because when this happens, when a new plane is created, it's not a new plane for eternity. It's not some Platonic ideal of a new plane. It's a new plane as it's created and emerged. But then you run into what everything else is, which is new people are born, older people integrate, or in this case, axiomatize that plane. And as new people come about, that old plane it's the old plane. Now, we still are constantly going. There's not one plane that we're all experiencing. There's not one thing we're all taking in. But as the multiplicity of things becomes more and more this weird broken apart and blasted apart thing where we have this sort of secondary element of value, the awkwardness we live in is very much what you're talking about. This is not a totality in the sense of everything is taken, we're hopeless. This is also not a create a new way of thinking and the world will explode. It's neither one of these. There's millions of interesting lines you can chase, lots of places to go, lots of ways to do it in lots of mediums and lots of forms. But there is a temporality to it. And again, these things become processed. An example would be Tim and Eric, I think, is a great example of sort of the weird nostalgia and play while also subverting the sort of values of the time. When it launched, it was revolutionary comedy. Same with, like, if we go back, we could say the same of Andy Kaufman. We can go back and say the same of Bill Hicks. We can go back and just talk about satirists like Deleuze loves Artaud for much of the same reason that we would see in some playwrights that were expanding in the 70s and 80s. The challenge we run into is the things that they blew apart immediately, and like they're breaking down codes. The axioms of life were able to just simply integrate it to the point where the commercial viability of all those things became very, not only standard, but I would say that the aesthetic choices or the things they were doing by being blown apart were integrated. And they simply were. It's one of the challenges I think every artist runs into at some point. But underneath it, more my point, the thing that you come up with that may be new pathway, new setup, I'm not saying not to, but that it will be axiomatized. Parts of it will be axiomatized. The thing that is doing that, capital, doesn't do it as like an action itself. It is the structure and the way capitalism operates and the subjectivity it creates, which enables this process to happen and to fall back on production, which is, again, the reason they use the term socius, and they compare capital to that of the despot or the earth. The earth fell back on all of the production that very much people did emergently. People built cities where they did everything. They farmed, they hunted, they had children, they cut down trees, whatever. But then they gave the blessings to the earth because the earth seemed to be, or took, the cause as its own. It became the quasi-cause of why we did what we did. There's some truth there. There's a weird sort of chicken and egg in the reason that people built the types of farms. It's a reason rice paddies are built in the mountains that they're built in and not in Kansas. And also a reason that in Kansas, corn does better than, like, the crops used, the way people lived, how they build houses is very much an environmental thing. It came out of it. But is it due to the earth? No, but they gave credit to the earth. The king very much hit through his edicts, sort of controlled society, sure. But what people did underneath the king wasn't a literal god. He doesn't actually control everybody. He doesn't, like, his edicts don't literally give that same impression. How they turned, what they did, how they set up, the king took credit for. He fell back on all production. He didn't actually make anything. Very, very rarely did they actually make anything. But all of it was for the king and done by the king. When we use the term here with capital, it's the same challenge. The challenge of capital is that everything seems like it's made through capital. Capital falls back on all production. The reason that factory got put where it is, well, it's because a bunch of people got together and they built it. Like, that's the reason it happened. They built the factory, and other guys built the machines that went in the factory, and this guy decided he wanted those here, and everyone agreed. So they did that. Now, why did it happen? Well, that guy has a bunch of money, and the money is what did it. And actually, really at large, the marketplace said that a factory needed to be built this way. So now we run into the capitalism did that. So when we talk about capital doing these things, this is the referent we're talking about. We're talking about the larger social odd order and the way capitalism works. Does that make sense, Josh? This is, again, how I understand it, but I'm pretty compelled to say I kind of know this one. Hold on for 2 seconds. Sorry. Hold on for 2 seconds. Sorry. I want to just make sure I get this right. The fucking Discord is not outputting on the right setting for audio. Give me 2 seconds. Sorry, Josh. I just want to make sure you're in the recording. It's all getting fucked. There we go. Talk for a second for me.
Testing 1, 2, 3.
Perfect. Thank you.
How's that?
All right, please go ahead.
Yeah. So, in relation to sort of a Foucaultian analysis, it makes very clear sense, right? You've got setups of inter-affecting sort of, forces, institutional arrangements, and right. I mean, there's no hierarchical top of this thing. It's all the way that we feed each of it. Well, as you described, inputs and outputs, they all feed back into each other, and it's sort of this right. But what conflicts for me with that is trying to grapple with this distinction between, say, the philosophical and capital. How is capital different from the philosophical? For Foucault, you've got every aspect of culture intertwines within a particular era, right? A stratum, and capital. To understand capital and the way that capital can, has its grips on us is no different than understanding the way that a particular culture seen from any other vantage has its grips in us, because it's really the same analysis or a similar analysis. But when you then jump to a certain kind of discussion that Deleuze gives on, in particular, with something like a philosophical plane, where now you've got this. It doesn't just take in. There's more going on here, or something slightly different seeming to go on here than us. If you want to call it an individual, right, or let's give it a proper name, a Nietzsche or a Plato or you or I, right, and the way that Deleuze treats how we're supposed to understand that that proper name in terms of conceptual persona and all these things. How we as being within this chain of continual inter-affectings and mutual reciprocal shapings, there's something that takes place, or something there's a transformation that takes place in the reception of these influences, and that's and which is which transforms them into what the elements of this philosophical plane, concepts, conceptual persona, self, such that they seem to lose their power. It's as if it tips the balance of influence from one in which the proper name becomes just sort of a cog within this larger social machine, to one in which there's a point of view, and I'm grappling with how to reconcile. It almost seems to me that okay, there are certain times and certain places in which you can have a remarkable phenomena that takes place surrounding a new name, like a Marx or a Nietzsche, right? But that's not something we're supposed to understand as being applicable to everyone who is participates within within society, or so I would I'd like to hear your feedback on that.
Well, I mean, you've said just about 1,000 things, so I'll do my best. I'm not going to disagree, I think, with anything you're stating. What you're doing is you're talking about a problematization specifically of how the socius functions and how we can create issues for it, how one might build inside of the space. I would just simply say the way that the socius operates, the capital operates, is it can take in anything. Now, whether or not that ends up breaking at some point, or that ends up shifting it, or the production and setup changes, I'm not going to say it won't. This is the sort of double-edged sword of how ultimately we can destroy capital. In order to do so, we have to create new lines of flight and visions, planes, whatever you fucking want to call it. We need to create the new. We need to create lots and lots of the new. And eventually, we hope it'll start to affect things. We kind of need to go new in a specific direction, maybe. And this is where you start getting into dicey conversations I kind of don't want to have. But underneath it, at the base, when we talk about what we're building and how we build, the argument they would have would be to sort of step back and ask, how did we end the domination of the despotic socius? And no one had a new like idea that just went, oh fuck, we're done, because we still have a lot of parts of it. But capital undid all of the nature of sort of the way that overcoding works and the despotic socialist taking pure credit. Didn't happen in a day, didn't happen with one person, but the process of all of these things slowly shifted, and our understanding of things slowly shifted to the point where now we have a new socius. So how did we defeat despotic? Did we defeat it, or did we just simply slowly make our way into a new socius through very different machinery and all sorts of different plays? And this would be, I think, a more a better direction to consider, because it's not really about destroying capitalism. It's not a thing we can really do, just like we didn't destroy despotism and we didn't destroy barbarism. That's not really what happened. These things mutated and shifted and changed over time in a various bunch of different ways. And now we're in a position where what we call ourselves is capital, and it's changing, and it may change further, probably after a very long period. But how we do it, what it's set up for, and understanding specifically how we are produced inside of it and how we exist, and will enable us to not only, in my mind, build more revolutionary tools or concepts or planes, as you may call it, but also to better handle the pain that comes within it. Just my thought. Does that make sense, Josh?
Yeah.
I'm not disagreeing. I would love to have and sit and have a real discussion at this long term, because you're hitting at the point of like where I want to take the text, but we're not there yet because I'm trying to explain the text itself. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm going to get to someone else because there's a Bats mention, and it's worth noting. So when I talk about extensive or intensive as qualitative or quantitative, I am shorthanding what I'm saying. There is something far more happening there, but again, this is a lot of shit, and I'm not going to spend, if I were to go, yeah, I just couldn't. To just quote Bats, is the usage D&G make of intension extension something they take from Whitehead in that tradition? Generally, yes, is the answer. If that's the case, then extension could be taken to be something a bit different from more quantitative aspects, though quantifiable ones. Could be linked to concepts of sense, which is linked with intention, and reference, linked with extension and semantics. Yes. When Frege and all of these things, and also a whole bunch of other thinkers, by the way, in that space. So generally speaking, yes. We were talking about extensive is referent, the reference. I'm trying not to say that with a T. It's very difficult. But the way we sense things and the sort of sensual apperception, I guess, it's more complex. This is why I just say quantifiable and qualitative, because it's just easier. So you're spot on. Drew asks, so we're saying capitalist structure can change the value of a given object, and all values get restructured, rebound. Yeah, sort of, yes. It's the capitalist structure gives value, and we kind of see things explode into capital. If we see a piece of art, a painting, we can absolutely just deal with it as a painting. And you can make a painting, great. Let's go with Basquiat, who was a street artist who really didn't give a fuck about money. He's kind of a weird dude, really amazing shit, kind of wild. The way he went about his days, he made art. Now, he made art. It did its thing. At some point, however, it became very much axiomatized. And I say that very, very loudly because, holy shit, once he was dead, his family got his estate. They're worth billions of dollars with his paintings. Each one of his paintings being very broken down into these basic little bits, these little things. And what did that? Well, it's these unquantifiable axiomatics that don't have the sort of determinacy at the base of them, but somehow spiderweb out and create the way that we find meaning, all of those things. It's kind of incredible. With that, and it is sad to see Basquiat apparel depoliticized. It's sad to see Basquiat stuff kind of in general. We're going to talk about binding, because as we've talked about The axiomatization of things is a new axiomatic is created and elements become bound to particular coordinates. And what do we mean by that? Again, we need to be thinking about all of these things in a deeply mathematical way. We've already talked about the derivative of things in Deleuze and in Anti-Oedipus. We have the flux. This is why they use the term flux. This is why these things matter. And the reason they use derivative X, derivative Y, the derivative of constant capital versus labor, fixed capital versus labor capital. These two elements, the derivative of them, the points on the graph. But why are they points on a graph? Why is a value hit a specific thing? Why do these work this way? Well, it's binding. To say, this is, by the way, this gets into a lot of really fun stuff. If you haven't read Pierre Clastre's, I have to recommend it. That's just leaving. Oh, sad. Phone cases of Basquiat print. Yeah, it's cool art. It's like, goddamn. I almost did a big Basquiat VR exhibit I worked on for like a year trying to get the rights to. Didn't have enough money. Kurt, is it my Wi-Fi that's my issue? I don't think so. Maybe Discord. Discord's been being funky lately. It may be your location. It may be a whole bunch of stuff. Yeah. Hard to know, Kurt. Also welcome. Kurt's new. Just fresh to the server, I think today. So is this 18 plus? Yeah, the server is generally speaking 18 plus. Yes. We try not to have kids around here at all because of, we're 16. See, yeah, you said something. Sorry, Kurt. You don't have to go. Nothing today is awful, but it's good to know. We'll figure it out. We don't have a lot of kids joining anymore, but damn. Just be cool. We don't have porn on the server. We don't have any of that weird shit. Just be ready for weird language. Damn. Becoming child philosopher, no kids. Seriously, Arachne. God damn it, Arachne. Binding. Binding, in this context, is a movement whereby a mode of organization that falls outside of a state formation is recast so that it is able to be integrated into the state. Pierre Clastres, for instance, argues that when we look at archaic non-state societies, we discover the organization of these societies intentionally wards off production of a surplus that could lead to the emergence of a differentiated class structure. The condition of possibility of the state involves recasting this model of society into one that understands action in terms of labor, thereby opening the possibility of surplus labor. The claim that Kant's transcendental deduction is itself an axiomatic gives us a model for understanding this process of recasting action as labor. I'll just pull back slightly. Pierre Clastres, for instance, argues when we look at archaic non-state societies, we discover that the organization of these societies intentionally wards off production of a surplus that could lead to the emergence of differentiated class structure. Society Against the State is the book being referenced here. Wonderful, wonderful book. The idea is that primitive societies were not aware of capitalism or despotism. They weren't really like aware. They were haunted by them, you might say, they were haunted by the specter of such things. But the way these primitive societies were set up very particularly disabled anyone from sort of gaining excess in too large of amounts. Strauss sort of went into this. Godelier, I think, did it better. Godelier, Metamorphosis, Enigma, The Gift, Metamorphosis of Kinship, and then his book on Strauss, which is called, I think it's just called Cloudly by Strauss. It goes into this, I think, a lot more deeply and better. But the idea from Pierre Clastres was that societies did very particular elements and structures that pushed people to ensuring that they were always giving a little bit extra. And so no one ever gathered. No one ever held on to excess. Excess is always created. There's no way of getting around it, to just go with Bataille. But the reality is that these societies, as they sort of were set up, had very, very complex realities. that stopped this odd class model from emerging. Again, not knowingly, but they were aware of troubles that would come when you would have this happen. This is pretty, I mean, it's a common thing you see in a lot of sort of prehistorical, what they would call primitive, but non-state archaic societies. You'd see this actually pretty commonly. So to talk about Deleuze and to move on, in Difference and Repetition, Deleuze presents an account of the constitution of experience that shows how the subject and its world arise from pre-individual's field of intensive processes. There, Deleuze argues that Kant's own account of synthesis necessarily distorts the nature of synthesis because Kant is subject to a transcendental illusion which Deleuze entitles representation. This illusion leads us to believe all determination operates in terms of the ascription of properties to subjects, which in turn implies that synthesis is understood as the act of a subject on a manifold. By synthesis, in its most general sense, I understand the act of putting different representations together and of grasping what is manifold in them in one act of knowledge. We'll just pull back a little bit. The constitution of experience, which is what you're having right now. You know how you're experiencing things? You're experiencing this right now. This is constituted of a series of processes. It's not a direct apperception of things. Not really what's going on. Ultimately, what's happening is there is a synthesis of things happening, which then produces the experience. This is the illusion that he's talking about here, this transcendental illusion, which Deleuze has entitled representation. This illusion leads us to believe all determination operates in terms of an ascription of properties to subject, which in turn implies that synthesis is understood as the act of a subject on a manifold. God damn it, how do I even start with this? The determination of value or meaning or sense. This illusion of representation makes us see or understand that this operates ultimately in terms of the ascription of properties to subjects. Oh, that cat is orange. That's why I'm seeing the cat as orange or understand it to be orange. Instead of the emergent syntheses of everything that causes that image to be seen in that way and understood in that way. Again, the reason we know cinnabar is red, and we're able to even say that, is the synthesizing of all of the different processes underneath, which allow us to have the eye that's seeing all of these things and all of these memories that we're bringing in and saying, oh, that's cinnabar. Because it's red, it's kind of this heavy, and then blah, blah, blah. It's a cat because it's kind of this heavy. It's a little fuzzy, it's a little warm, it's blah, blah, blah. Whatever it may be. This setup gets confused. The illusion is, as he says, I understand the act of putting different representations together and grasping what is manifold in them, one act of knowledge. Finding the same in them as a single act that is being done rather than the synthesizing of the process to get there. We'll get through it, don't worry. The presupposition of a subject rules out in advance the possibility of an intensive field itself giving rise to the structure of a subject, leading to the kind of epiphenomenal account Kant ends up with, where synthesis is replaced, the representation of synthesis. Kurt, you're making me real uneasy with the questions. I mean, we do have a 18 plus sort of setup, so apologies. It's been fun. Yeah. That's yeah. Sorry about that, everyone. Always fun. So we get people coming into the server who are clearly not what they're saying, and then they make we have a handful of really weirdo trolls. That's a whole thing. No interest in dealing with it. Anyway, we're about to get into Kant and the way that the synthesis is replaced with a representation of it. This is a deleuze kind of running through. I think this is going to be from What is Philosophy? We have seen that receptivity, understood as a capacity for experiencing affections, was only a consequence, that the passive self was more profoundly constituted by a synthesis, which is itself passive. The possibility of receiving sensations or impressions follows from this. It is impossible to maintain the Kantian distribution, which amounts to a supreme effort to save the world of representation. Here, synthesis is understood as active and is giving rise to a new form of identity in the I, while passivity is understood as simple receptivity without synthesis. This is complicated because Deleuze's reading of Kant is, we'll just say, not the normal reading, and his critique of Kant is not the normal critique. But he also isn't throwing the baby out with the bathwater. He's instead doing what he does with every philosopher. He reads them, and then he takes them further. For Kant specifically, the challenge for Kant is that he has this sort of odd synthesis. He has active and passive syntheses. Not a thing that Deleuze really wants to deal with or talk about, because it kind of puts us in a weird place where the active is understood, the synthesis is understood as active and is giving rise to a new form of identity. Passivity is understood as a simple receptivity without synthesis, as if you were directly apperceiving something without the synthesis happening. The active form is you understanding subjectivity or a subject seeing something. But this error, as they're calling it, or as they will call it, the paralogism, and it's one of Deleuze's sort of major critiques of this, it carries on, and actually it's probably said better here than I can say. Deleuze and Guattari's diagnosis of this error is that such representational accounts presuppose a logic of solid bodies. Very simply put, you see a cat, well, this presumes you know where the edges of the cat are. A question I've always loved asking, how you can tell someone's a real neuroscientist, by the way, is asking them, where's the edges of the brain? And if they don't smile and chuckle a little bit, then they're just an asshole. Because we'd like to think it's our skull, but that's not really how it works. Like what we call the brain and how it's set up. If you write something on a notepad and you forget about it, and when you see it, you remember, is that notepad an extension of your brain? Is your finger also an extension? Like these things, the question of where the edges are or a solid body is, what a body is, how these bodies work, this becomes a super huge challenge of like understanding. And it is the thing that sort of is at the outset for what Deleuze's critique of Kant is. That Kant starts with, oh, cinnabar is a solid body. It is this thing. And that's sort of the problem. It's the paralogism within the syllogism Kant puts out. We can get a sense of what this means from Bergson's analysis of counting. Bergson notes that when we are confronted with a series of objects to count rather than simply list, the first thing we need to do is disregard the qualitative differences between them. Counting requires us to see the collection as qualitatively homogeneous in order to be a part of the same group for the purpose of counting. Counting sheep, for example, just as a base thing. There you go. You have to see the collection as, oh, all these are sheep. All of them are qualitatively homogeneous in order to be a part of the same group so we can count them. Because you're counting sheep. That's how that works. Once we have removed the notion of qualitative distinctness, however, then we need an alternative principle of individuation. This is given by occupying a different position within the homogeneous space. We can see a similar structure at play in Kant's thought. Kant's claim that the I think must accompany all of my representations presupposes that these representations are seen as essentially distinct from each other and self-sufficient, much as objects are. Representations then require something in order to hold them together. This is their binding by the I think, which here functions as a homogeneous medium that allows them to be related in much the same way as a space made possible. So when you see all of those sheep you're going to count, the I think that sets up there is necessary, but also, by the way, just talking about counting presupposes the I think, and it's bound to it in a way that is kind of insidious and there at the outset without even really considering it, even by Kant's own standard, really, which is kind of amazing. To quote Bergson, concepts, in fact, are outside each other like objects in space. They have the same stability as such objects on which they have been modeled. Taken together, they constitute an intelligible world that resembles the world of solids in its essential characters, but whose elements are lighter, more diaphanous, easier for the intellect to deal with than the image of concrete things. They are not, indeed, the perception itself of things, but the representation of the act by which the intellect is fixed on them. They are therefore not images, but symbols. Our logic is a complete set of rules that must be followed using symbols. Spot on. To continue. Representation, then, is the site of the transcendental illusion, essentially holding all determination operates in terms of the connection by a juxtaposition in a homogeneous medium of discrete determinations. Fucking great sentence. Highlight it. I'm going to copy it. We'll come back to it because this is kind of, again, one of those other sentences that sort of matters super deeply. Now, we can see this Kantian moment also at play in the mathematical model of axiomatics. When we look at the definition of the set, the basic notion of a collection at the heart of the axiomatic method, we find that it too is structured according to the transcendental illusion of representation. As Čapek puts it, quote, Cantor's definition of the set, mange, as a collection of definite, well-discernible objects, not saying the German, shows clearly the external character of the relations in which its constitutive elements stand to each other, relations which are modeled after the relation of juxtaposition. This is where we start getting to the binding. Again, to go back, the axiomatic of numbers, zero is a number, numbers, sequential, etc., that setup, the indeterminate elements of those, there's a determinacy that gets put to them when we have a set. Yes, this set applies to those axioms. Excellent. This set, no, it does not apply. That a set does this. And when we see, for example, to just go right back to that quote from Bergson that was said a moment ago, when we see a whole object, or when we presume a whole object in Kant's world, we see a cat or a tree or cinnabar or any of these things, there are presumptions about all of it that are taken in that we don't even notice. This setup here is what we have. This is the process, to continue, of what D&G will call striating space, where determination is reduced to the imposition of form on matter. What Deleuze and Guattari call nomadic thought will operate in terms of non-formal modes of determination. The new discourse is no longer that of the form, but neither is that of the formless. It is rather of the purely unformed. Such a great set of words. So this is where we start getting into, and I think this next little bit will actually carry us through the rest of this reading. I'm going to try, I may stop at 2 hours. We may, because we're not making the progress I was kind of hoping. We're about, I don't know, we're not quite, we're going to probably get halfway through this. But I want to be able to finish it, so we'll probably finish it later this week or next week. This section is where all of it gets brought together, and it's fantastic. Let me see. Did I actually? Because I don't think I found an English version. If I don't find an English version, I end up tending to order online. Yeah, I did not find Anne Quirin's work that they reference here in English. I have a book on the way for. Doesn't matter. There's a couple of French versions online you can read. I'll get through it though, because this is a really great example of what they're talking about. Deleuze and Guattari do provide several more intuitive counts of binding that show how this process operates in practice. They helpfully cite Anne Quirin's work on the introduction of descriptive geometry into engineering in the 18th century. Literally what the book is about. When we talk about the way, and he's going to explain this, but I just want to mention to sort of help give a foundation. We're talking about how buildings are built. Like the actual process. Someone designs, someone oversees, people build, they make parts, someone puts it in every single step of the way of what makes a building that has ever existed in the history of mankind. It's really fantastic to sort of understand all of those steps. It's a really weird thing that happened in 17-ish hundreds, right when geometry sort of really took off, mathematics and things. The way that these things shifted and how they worked is really, it's a beautiful piece. This explains it nicely. I'm kind of pre-hyping myself. Prior to the introduction of descriptive geometry, construction involved a negotiation between the engineer, who understood the aims of a construction process, and the artisan, who understood the various singularities which define the characteristic of the material. Let's break apart and talk about what each one of those means. Engineer was the person effectively designing or running the building. We need to build a house, we need to build a cathedral, we need to build a castle, whatever it was. The engineer or the person in charge of the project would talk to artisans. And this is, by the way, how it was done up until the 1700s. This goes back thousands of years. Because it wasn't just a fungible thing as we have now where, oh, who's the guy that makes the blocks and the bricks? No. Artisans made bricks. That was actually a thing. It was a skill, and it was a particular line of work. And also bricklaying was sort of that. The masons would build the bricks and they'd be set up. But the engineer, who understood the aims of the construction process, he had the grand vision in mind. And the artisan understood the singularities. The term is important here. How bricks needed to be made. And an engineer may say, oh, I need a wall that's 200 feet high with an arch 500 feet wide. And he's like, that's not how this fucking works. We have these kinds of bricks. I can get these. You have to shrink this. It can only be this wide. It can only be this setup. Like, the artisan understood the singularities which defined the characteristics of the material. This changed with the introduction of descriptive geometry, which allows for precise specification of form and can be applied to a range of domains regardless of the materials used to specify what the engineer required. It is, in effect, a universal language, and for Quirin, leads the engineer to become the one who is trained in, quote, the handling of an ideological discourse rather than position of a professional skill. This is, by the way, not just binding, this is axiomatizing. This example is the thing when we talk about, I'm just presetting it. When we talk about the decoding of codes and the reaxiomatizing, when we talk about the obliteration and the rebuilding, the stuff we were talking about earlier, Josh, who's still here, good. This is the thing. The master carpenter did not want to abandon his traditional drawing methods for the new language, which implied a much more radical hierarchy of work between the designer and the executor. Thanks to the new language, the designer can in fact enter into the most small details of the execution, adopting an entirely prescriptive attitude, whereas until then he had to respect the conventions specific to the trades, their traditional know-how, their particular language. With descriptive geometry, a technical graphic language is developed which installs the power of synthesis, of coordination, of the engineer on the building trades. At this point, we have the movement from the artisanal relation to the singularities of the materials they work with to a science of forms, and with it, a movement from mutual education and practice to hierarchy. Quote, descriptive geometry is a language necessary and common to the man of genius who conceives a product, to the artist who must direct its execution, and the workman who must execute it. See the hierarchy there? Boom, boom, boom. Quirin's example shows the interconnection of a certain conceptual understanding of the world and its implications for transformation of economic organization. The introduction of a descriptive geometry involves a transformation of the understanding of the material the artisan works on. The work of the artisan is now governed by a model produced by a designer, a form which takes no account of the singularities or particularities of the material the artisan has to work with. Thus, the introduction of a descriptive geometry is transformative of the nature of work and draws with it a transformation of power relations. Quote, in any case, if the state always finds it necessary to repress the nomad and minor sciences, if it opposes vague essences and the operative geometry of the trait, it does so not because the content of these sciences is inexact or imperfect, or because of their magic or initiatory character, but because they imply a division of labor opposed to the norms of the state. The difference is not extrinsic. The way in which a science or a conception of science participates in the organization of the social field, and in particular induces a division of labor, is part of that science itself. Royal science is inseparable from a hylomorphic model, implying both a form that organizes matter and matter prepared for the form. Laying it all out bit by bit as we kind of make our way through. This is where binding comes to be. I'm hoping you're following, Josh, because this was like literally, I think, the thing you were sort of getting at a little bit. We'll get deeper, but I want to keep pushing. The introduction of descriptive geometry is a process of binding that introduces a new model of labor that no longer recognizes the singularities of the materials which the artisan relies on, but operates in terms of the definition of form via extensive planes. This in turn allows for a particular distribution of labor where the engineer and the artisan take on a hierarchical and formal relation to each other. First, we have a process whereby an activity or territory is re-territorialized on a new form, thus altering the coordinates by which the activity is understood. Then on a second level, the new structure allows a system of homogeneous comparison, which opens the way to exploitation. This, therefore, is the process of mutilation with which D&G associate binding. They write, state overcoding is precisely the structural violence that defines the law, police violence, and not the violence of war. There is lawful violence wherever violence contributes to the creation of that which is used against, or, as Marx says, wherever capture contributes to the creation of that which it captures. When we talk about the movement of these things to these odd, extensive quantities, when we start talking about the moves of these axiomatizing systems, the thing that continually happens is a push towards particularized distributions of labor, a stratifying of class, the engineer to the artisan, but again, in particular case, but if we extrapolate that, the engineer, he's not at the top of the pile. Engineer ain't there. It's not the setup. Who's there? The capitalist. Like that, in the same way, the way that the idea from the engineer now can be stratified in its own way. It utilizing these forms that are fungible, that are swappable, that are distributed. He can build and say, here's how I want the cathedral built. And then that then goes to the next level and the next level. They have to make the vision happen. They have to do it. And they follow that line instead of the engineer originally, hey, here's what I want. Yeah, you can't do that. All right, well, what about this? That back and forth is gone. Now hierarchized. Because guy at the top is able to utilize symbols, which we all utilize and we all integrate, we all build, utilizing these fungible symbols to say what needs to be done. The capitalist does this with capital. Capital is this in the same exact way. To continue on this one, though, because I really like the example, I want to continue with it. Just be thinking, they're using this example to talk about how the axiomatic builds. Opposed to this thought of extensive geometries in solid bodies, D&G develop a hydraulic model rather than a theory of solids, treating fluids as a special case. This will be what they call no matter minor science. They argue that war machines are systems which attempt to constitute what they call smooth spaces, in effect counteracting the process of binding that is at the heart of the state. Once again, in keeping with the parallels between different domains where the same mode of organization may occur, D&G note that this same set of conflicts between smooth and striated spaces may occur both in politics and between different images of our categories of thought. This claim helps us understand their claims that, quote, a method is the striated space of a cogitatio universalis and draws a path that must be followed from one point to another, and that the form of exteriority situates thought in a smooth space that it must occupy without counting, and for which there is no possible method, no conceivable reproduction, but only relays, intermezzos, resurgences. Here, we can draw a parallel with Bergson's account of movement. which we can only represent as a trajectory that passes through a series of points, but which escapes this representation and is, quote, like the vampire, has no image either to constitute a model or to copy. We argue about movement as though it were made of immobilities, and when we look at it, it is with immobilities we reconstitute. Movement for us is a position, then another position, and so on indefinitely. We say it is true that there must be something else, and that from one position to another there is a passage by which the interval is cleared. But as soon as we fix our attention on this passage, we immediately make it a series of positions, even though we still admit that between two successive positions, one must indeed assume a passage. I do love Bergson. I do love Bergson. The way we talk of movement is as if we were talking about a series of immobilities. We talk about moving from point A to point B. We even talk about velocity, the distance, point A, point B, movement time. There you go. And it's in time is cross sections of that. It's a series of immobilities as you move. But when we talk about the passage itself, we immediately make it a series of these positions, even though we admit that between two successive positions, one must assume a passage. Deleuze refers to this nicely, also in Logic of Sense. It's the opening one, series one, on becoming larger. Alice becomes larger. When we say this sentence, when we talk about it, there is no moment that Alice is actually larger, because at any moment she's the fucking size she is. In order to say that Alice is larger, we have to actually consider her size now to what her size was. Her size now is bigger than she was. Alice is larger. But when we say Alice is becoming larger, now we've got a completely different beast. Now we've got a movement between 2 points. Past, smaller, the size she will be, larger, and she's in the middle. So in order to say Alice becoming larger, we are actually considering almost 3 Alices. Where she is now, the duration of that, where she's going and where she's been. And all of these things are wrapped in just one Alice. It's an odd thing that happens when we start talking about the totality or the positionality of these, when we talk about these elements. But this becomes that challenge. And this element of binding, where we say, oh, Alice is becoming larger, or when we say something is moving, something is created, capital makes money, whatever it may be, these odd things that work this way, the way language operates, the way representation works, is the binding. The binding, just to continue in the next paragraph, the notion of binding then is integral to the process of axiomatization. One might expect axiomatics is related to royal science, and the great axiomaticians are men of state of science who seal off lines of flight so frequent in mathematics, who would impose a new binding, if only a temporary one, and who lay down the official policies of science. What it means at the base. When we were talking about how to count, start with 0. 0 is a number. The numbers follow in sequence. Whole number. This sets us up into this odd play. This is what is an axiomatic. Axiomatics happen across mathematics. All of these things. But the setup here is that these axioms are coming from on high. They are part of royal science. This is where the axiomaticians began. If you go look them up, they started in this way. DG's got a great piece on this. It's in Millepetot, where they talk about it. Deleuze and Guattari divide their analysis of the axiomatic of capitalism into 7 givens. I'm not going to go through all the givens here, thank God. In particular, I want to leave to one side the givens that deal with the ways in which states may be organized through addition and subtraction of axioms, to focus instead on the question of completeness, non-denumerability. In these axioms that explain in the most nuanced manner, it is these axioms that explain in the most nuanced manner the interrelation of set theoretic and Kantian strands of Deleuze and Guattari's account. First given is that of completeness. If anyone here has a background in Gödel or complex mathematics, this is fun. Blanche's presentation. Blanche presents 2 limitations of the axiomatic. The first related to Gödel's theorem, the second to Skollem's paradox. Let's actually take a second. Let's do a, because I don't want to get this wrong. I do not want to get the incompleteness theory, Gödel's theorem, is the core idea that any set can't really contain, any large number of sets can't really contain the set itself. Kind of always, correct me if I'm wrong, Bats. I know you're a star at this stuff. That's like the basic, that sets can't contain the set of its own set. Kind of creates this really fascinating sort of setup. Skollem's paradox is the way that any countable models, is that Russell's paradox? It's Russell's paradox. Well, we'll take a second. Skollem's paradox. We'll bring up our friend. The idea is that you have blah, blah, blah. Come on, set it up. In 1922, Skollem pointed out a seeming contradiction between these things. It implies that there is a countable oh, Jesus Christ, there's just so much more. Yeah, I'm not going to do that. Fuck this. Fucking math nerds. Math nerds. Yeah, that'll just make me tired. We're not going to do that. We're going to continue through this, and he goes lightly into it. In effect, we can read these as developing an account of the external and internal limitations of the axiomatic, though D&G read these as interrelated. Turning to the external limitations, Blanche describes completeness in the following terms. Quote, a system of postulates is called complete when of two contradictory propositions correctly formulated in terms of the system, one at least can always be demonstrated. This is a mathematic shit. I don't know if I can say it simpler. Postulates and axiomatics are complete with, when you have them, when we have two things that are stated within the system, we're able to actually make one of them happen. One of them can be demonstrated. We can show them to be accurate. Now, there's two important senses in which an axiomatic may not be complete. The first is if it is intentionally weakened, such that a level of indetermination is deliberately induced into the system. We can see how this works using Blanche's example of geometry. If, for example, we deny the uniqueness of the parallel while retaining intact the other Euclidean postulates, we obtain geometry which, though differing from that of Euclid, has the same logical characteristics. Non-Euclidean space is fascinating, by the way. But if, on the other hand, we allow the number of possible parallels to be completely undetermined, that is to say, if instead of replacing the postulate concerning the parallels by another, we content ourselves with simply omitting it, leaving as it were a gap in the system, then we obtain the principles of a more general geometry, of which Euclidean and other geometries appear as particular specializations. Euclidean geometry, one of the rule of parallelization, for example, is that two parallel lines will never intersect. If we weaken it, so we can say there's multiple ways that parallels can sort of play inside of themselves. We end up with sort of a derivative. I don't want to say derivative, it's probably a shitty way to put it, but the one they mentioned, I'm not going to pronounce it correctly. It's a Lobachevskian geometry, which you can actually see a really interesting example of. There's a guy who made a game based on it, actually. And someone mentions, Estelle mentions Hyper Rogue. Hyper Rogue's great. There's a bunch of really interesting non-Euclidean games. But at its base level, Lobachevskian geometry, because it modifies and adds sort of elements to the rules that are at the basis of Euclidean postulates, it creates sort of a derivative of that. Even though it has a lot of the same Euclidean characteristics, it will be different from that of Euclid. But on the other hand, if we say, actually, parallels don't matter, fuck, we're just going to take that rule entirely out, we end up in a place sort of more generalized. I don't want to say above, but in a way that actually we would sort of see a set appear that includes both Euclidean and Lobachevskian geometries as specializations of a greater geometric theory. Does that make sense as I say it? I'm hoping that makes sense. because it's kind of a lot, but it's, hey, look, we have a system of mathematics that has 10 rules. If I modify one of them, it kind of becomes a subset of Euclidean geometry. It'll have a lot of the same general showings, there's a lot of the same general logical realities, mathematical realities, but it won't be identical to Euclid because obviously we've made modifications. So it's kind of almost a subset connected to it. But if we remove one of the rules entirely, we end up with kind of a superset almost, where it's a more broader geometrical system, and those two seem like specializations of it. To continue, here we have a nested series of geometries, such that we move from the general to the specialized. Also the case that Gödel's proof shows any axiomatic of even a rudimentary expressive power is incomplete in this sense. Nagel and Newman, in their book on Gödel's proof, sums it up as follows. Gödel showed that Principia, Russell's attempt to derive mathematics from logic, or any other system within which arithmetic can be developed, is essentially incomplete. In other words, given any consistent set of arithmetical axioms, there are true arithmetical statements that cannot be derived from the set, even if the axioms of arithmetic are augmented by an indefinite number of the other ones. There will always be further arithmetical truths that are not formally derivable from the augmented. This, again, the mathematics of this is not the important part, even though it sounds like it. Just trust me. The bigger deal here is understanding how these things work and how these axioms create the systems and the logical structures that allow various things to be part of them in various ways. The second limitation is of a different nature. This is the non-denumerable infinities, such as those of real numbers, the continuum, escape from the axiomatic. Another limit is traced to the use of the axiomatic method by a paradoxical theorem of Skolem. To any system that goes beyond a certain fairly elementary level that includes a model in any domain, it is possible to also assign a model in the domain of natural numbers. Now, a set of natural numbers constitutes a countable infinity, which is the weakest power of infinite sets. It therefore follows from this theorem that the axiomatic treatment causes all the higher powers to vanish in a way. Continuum, for example, cannot be conceived axiomatically in its structural specificity, since any axiomatic we give of it will include a countable model. Now, there's a reason he's chosen these two as setting up, and again, I know the mathematics of this is a bear, but instead of thinking of it as the mathematics, think of it again as what we were talking about before, that there are these axiomatized logical principles through which they themselves have no denumerability, just like 0 is just a placeholder for something else until we create a rule for that, which is then a placeholder for something else. And there's kind of this infinite regression that would then go on. The set itself is these 4 rules. Mathematicians accept this, it's fine. We have the 2 problems. The first is that any set of these axioms necessarily has to be augmented by an almost infinite number of others that aren't part of that, that aren't stated. This goes on kind of forever. This is Gödel's sort of critique of Russell. The other half is that if we have a system necessarily that goes beyond the most basic, and it's important when we say that there's a complexity to it. It's not just 1 rule, 2 rules. We get to the point where there's axiomatization, 17, 20, 100, so many rules, and it includes a model in any domain. You can also assign a model in the domain of natural numbers. This is Skolem's paradox. I'm not going to get into it. I don't fully understand it. But again, the point is less Skolem's paradox itself, and instead this last bit. Because ultimately, the continuum, for example, cannot be conceived axiomatically in a structural specificity, since any axiomatic we give of it will include a countable model. The necessity of having sort of this continuum, an infinite, for example, that it has to include, if it is infinite, it has to include this countability, it has to include natural numbers, if it is infinite. But at that point, it makes it countable, which kind of becomes its own sort of odd paradox and doesn't really work. Just flatly just doesn't work. We have a sense of what it is, but it doesn't work. So to continue, and then we'll be finishing up, we're going to finish up actually probably after this paragraph, and then we'll take a second for questions. If there are any, start typing. And then next week we'll continue from here because this is about halfway. And we'll retread a little bit of this too. 2 seconds. I just scrolled too far now. I suck so hard. Oh, there it is. This is not a problem of completeness in a formal sense, since it is not one of the conceivable structures, not being provable within an axiomatic, but rather one of certain structures being inconceivable within the axiomatic. Nonetheless, DNG introduce it here, noting that the axiomatic seems unable to properly capture the nature of flux. There is always a fundamental difference between living flux and the axioms that subordinate them, interests of control and decision-making, that make a given segment correspond to them, which measure their quanta. Blanche sees both of these problems as emerging from the exclusion of intuition from axiomatics. Intuition loosely corresponding to the conception of science as related to problems with affinities of no-man science rather than axioms. To just quickly restate, the way they said it nicely here, Blanche sees both these problems as emerging from the exclusion of intuition. The idea that we deal with sort of the way that we find affinities between systems, affinities between elements, the way that we sort of utilize the intuitive instead of having to hyper-quantify, instead of having to axiomatize. You will be able to, if you have an axiom system, it kind of can't ever be completed. You will never be able to add enough axioms to ensure there's nothing left out. That's kind of the point of this. And so there's this odd intuitive element that loosely corresponds with this that she wants to introduce. And D&G are pulling back towards that. Last little bit we'll get through and then we'll be done. These two claims then, all this math, think about again, the principles of it instead, suggest there is a limit to the capitalist axiomatic. Deleuze and Guattari's claim is that while capitalism sees these limits as being limits of the world, they're actually limits of the nature of representation itself. Capitalism would like for us to believe that it confronts the limits of the universe, the extreme limit of resources and energy, but all it confronts are its own limits, the periodic depreciation of existing capital. All it repels or displaces are its own limits, formation of new capital, the new industries with a high profit rate. Hey, look, I invented something new and cool. Oh my God, we're going to make so much money. Yay! But then this setup, this new capital, new industries, high profit rate, eventually, and again, take social media as an example, collapses, as it is, excessively collapses, maybe, in our case, as we're experiencing. And this limit of capitalism, this feels this odd thing like it's repelling its limits by forming new capital and new industries with a high profit rate. And then it has its own limit where ultimately it grew too fast. Oh, no, it is. We just didn't make enough money. Oh, nothing can grow forever. Oh, eventually everything has to crunch back in. And there's this periodic depreciation of existing capital, this back and front. This is the limitation of capital, but it's perceived as the limitations of the universe, as the limitations of everything. To understand how this account of limits work, we need to turn to D&G's account of power. Here, Blanche's definition of power in this context. This is, to bring everything together, is Blanche's paragraph. Two sets are said to have the same power when one can establish between their elements a one-to-one correspondent. To any element of one corresponds one and only one element of the other reciprocally. That for finite sets, having the same power is reduced to having the same number of elements. That is, for infinite sets, the weakest power is that of the countable, indefinite sequence of natural numbers. The power of the continuum, that, for example, on the points of a line or the set of real numbers, is greater than that of the countable. Take for a second. We'll just stop for a second. I fucking so want to just burn through the rest of the fucking paper. Fuck, do I do that? That seems like it's going to be a lot. Fuck it. We're going to keep going. God damn it. Yeah, we're going to do that. Power is important here. Two sets are said to have the same power. One can establish between their elements a one-to-one correspondence, the correspondence being the key word. If we return to Skolnick's paradox to continue, we saw that it shows that axiomatics can only relate to a countable arithmetical domain. It is thus unable to account for the continuum. Oh, see, people are having to go. I know, it's fucking 2 hours is a long time for this. You know what? I am going to stop. I will fucking obsess and I will not. We'll pause here. So enjoy, go homomorphism, go Drew, go enjoy. We'll be around later this week or next week. I'll be continuing from here. Please, if you like what we do, jump on YouTube, give a like for sure. But join the Quarantine Collective. Come say hi, all that good stuff. Discord.gg/DGQC, and we will continue this next week because this is like super, super, super fucking important to understanding AO. Super important. With that, I need to figure out where I'm going to send my 3 people on YouTube. Send them somewhere cool. Oh, I could just, the problem is like I could just do this fucking forever. I really could. And so it's like, where do I go? What do I do? How do I set that up? Like, yeah, a lot. There's just so much going on. There, I'll send you over, if you get a chance, take a look at In Time. I'll be on there tonight because there's the presidential debate and I'll be doing live commentary, which should be fun. And the article is above a little bit. Link to it and here. And then we'll go through this next week, and then we may actually take time and go through also Daniel Smith's piece on axiomatics, because it is that important. I mean, I don't know how else to put it. Like, if you can't get the concept of the axiomatic, we're not going to be able to get the concept of any of it, because at the base level of how capitalism works is not the power from above coming down on us. This is not how it operates. It operates within how subjectivity is produced. And this is something that is deeply important to understanding the rest of the book. There's no point in going into the schizoanalysis section if you think that there's like, oh no, it's all about the capitalist controlling us. Like, fucking forget about it. Start over. That's not the point. But otherwise, enjoy. We'll talk to everyone next week. It'll be lovely. And I'll see you all then.